Coca-Cola is delicious. The Sad Boys Book Club is not sponsored by Coca-Cola, but I will still tout its praises because I'm a simp.
Negative, Major Tom. Negative. It is imperative that you remain in the capsule. Oh boy, there you go.
It is the distant future, the year 2000.
Houston, we have a podcast.
Rolling like a ball.
Rolling like the mall.
Rolling down the hall.
Heading to a fall.
Nope, it hit a wall.
Heard the sirens call.
Better call Saul.
Sounding like a doll.
I gotta rhyme. I'm just trying to think of a sentence to build it.
Okay.
Coming after all.
Actually, surprisingly small.
The next one I was going to use was tall.
Wow.
Leviathan Wakes, final episode. Welcome to Sad Boys Book Club. My name is Dusty.
And I'm Daniel.
This book was a straight up fucking 10 out of 10 for me.
Wow. Coming in with very high praise there.
This is not going to be surprising for anyone who's been paying attention. My metric, I have my own little metric of rating system that I do. And for me, a 10 out of 10 is, I consider that as excellent and an instant favorite. And that perfectly describes this book for me. Like, it's not perfect. It is by no means perfect. But my enjoyment of it was so much so that I can't help but give this the highest possible rating that I could as a reader.
Well, I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, to rate it based on your own sort of level of enjoyment, I think there's that's I don't know. It can be difficult to objectively rate things, which is why I tend to not at least at this juncture of the podcast. I don't know that I feel like I can give good ratings, but yeah, I think that's a good rating or a good system of rating that you have there, where you are using your level of personal enjoyment as your barometer for the rating, because right now I'm going through this. I mean, this has not always been the case for me, but I'm in this weird phase where I don't feel very confident in the way to rate a piece of art, whether that's literature or music or a video game, a movie. I've just had difficulty making real determinations because of I'm being really confronted by the subjectivity of my perceptions vis-a-vis art. So I'm having a hard time putting down like a solid rating from a technical perspective, but I think having a rating from an enjoyment perspective is a lot more valid. Although again we run into the problem of becoming even more subjective, if that's even possible. But yeah, that's I don't know. I've really, but that's all that to say. I've quite enjoyed the book. I don't think I ever really ended up fully bonding with one of the characters, or like the way you had. I guess the closest would be Fred. I really like Fred, especially as we get to see him a little bit more as the story goes along. But I don't know. I think for me this was a lot of enjoyment of plot and a lot of enjoyment of the world. I think Naomi and Fred were characters that I liked, but they weren't, with the exception of Fred, I guess, towards the very, very end, never really a point of view character. So there was not as much I guess there's not as you don't see from their perspective as much, and therefore their importance in the novel is somewhat minimized in that respect.
I will say, I'm happy to be wrong about Fred. I was ready for there to be some sort of heel turn and him be like, "Oh, now the protomolecule is mine." So I'm glad to see that. And I said as much last week, but I'm glad that wasn't the case and that he ended up being about as close to good as someone that is bogged down with all of this bureaucracy can be.
Yeah, I think that he probably is, essentially the best person that in terms of when you're looking at the different leaderships of the different factions of the OPA, of the Earth, of Mars. We may not know the exact people that are in charge of the former two factions, but we can just kind of infer from the way that our characters interact with those factions that there's a little bit more. They are a little bit more. I guess I would say self-interested, although that's not entirely fair. It's just I'm trying to find the way to put it, but they're not necessarily as well-intended as Fred and the OPA at this juncture in this series seem to be.
Yeah. So I feel like this final section of the book, this final fifth or so, not a huge amount in the way of plot because it's wrapping up. A lot of it once again goes back into character moments as we are building towards this finale here. To do a quick synopsis real quick, the finale being that Miller has the plan that Eros needs to be taken care of, otherwise someone is going to use it, like I thought would very much be a thing that could happen. And his idea is to essentially ram Eros with enough momentum so that the inertia created puts it on track to collide with the sun, destroying the station, and nobody will be able to stop it in time. And they learn that there is an Earth scientific vessel and escort heading to Aero Station, so they have to work fast. They have to go now, and that's the general plan. And obviously it goes to shit, and they have to work on the fly to come up with a final solution. And so that's the general premise of this final little bit here, but most of it is spent with, honestly, Miller and his final solution, both to the plot and as a character. And, man, those Miller chapters, those last handful were, I don't want to say hard because it was still a very, very engrossing page turner, but just being inside of his mind and watching how he just kind of comes to terms with his life at that point and decides how he's going to essentially end it on his terms, and how his ending comes about is just a lot. Just a lot, man. Miller was the best character in this book, in my opinion.
It was very touching in a lot of ways. I think it was a very good portrayal of someone who is just, he's been pushed to his limit. He's just a very tired person, and he just doesn't really have the energy or the inclination that it would take to, come back from the things that he has had to do, or is perceived he's had to do, and I guess sort of rehumanize himself. So one of the things, I think that this book does very effectively is kind of show, to a certain extent, the sort of emotional and perhaps spiritual exhaustion that a very a life essentially that it estranges you from your humanity is, how what kind of toll that takes on a person, what it would drive them to, and how they would they would differently perceive the world and how they would think and feel. And I think that's something that is very well explored in Miller. He mentions towards the end, and I guess this should, perhaps be a content warning, for what's to come. But Miller is a passively suicidal person. Who they mention as having suicidal ideation, and that's something that he mentions, and I think you could probably pick up on that if you were to go back through, and read this a second time. You could see it through certain self-destructive behaviors, perhaps in the alcoholism, perhaps in his rather blasé way that he handles going into danger, particularly in moments like trying to board the Rocinante on the Aero station, essentially charging into gunfire. Shielding, limited shielding notwithstanding, I think that's still a very and while they didn't have necessarily a lot of other opportunities, I think it does speak to a certain sort of desperation or laissez-faire outlook about protecting their lives. And I guess finally he even says, when they're during this last section that we've read, it mentions that he is too tired to do. In his, I think I can't quite quote it line and verse, but it's there. It mentions that he's too tired to, I guess, make the effort that it would take to restart his life, to kind of heal from this sort of lifetime that he's had where he is estranged from human nature.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. He's I think Miller is of the opinion that he's just kind of he's hit his zenith, so to say, and now the best thing he can do is just see this Julie Mao and all of the proto-molecule business. He could see it out in his own way, and that will be the exclamation point at the end of his life.
Well, I guess that is true of a certain extent, but I hasten to point out that they do mention, on a couple of occasions, and I wish I could find in my notes where I mentioned this, but I think they made a point of his growing suicidality, in terms of mentioning that he'd had a previous diagnosis. And also, just the feeling of exhaustion, and not wanting to continue in the life that he has lived, but feeling too tired to really put in the effort that it would take to change his life in some way.
I feel like the most important part of Miller's storyline here at the end of the novel is the revelation he comes to inside of Aero Station. So, context. At this point, Aero Station has dodged the Nauvoo, which was Miller's plan for sending Aero Station on a collision course with the sun. They were going to ram the Nauvoo into it with such force that it would cause that amount of inertia needed. Aero Station... Miller's plan was to stay on Aero Station and watch it happen and go out in a blaze of glory as it happens. But what happened is Aero Station just decides to dodge it as it's coming in. Just no biggie. Just press the B button, boom, dodge, and it starts going on an accelerated course toward Earth, which has now been causing some big stress for everybody else involved. And Miller's decision now is he's talked with Holden, and Earth is sending all of its nuclear arsenal on a collision course with Aero Station to try and completely wipe it out of the system. And Miller's suggestion is he's going to drag one of the nukes on the ships that the OPA brought to try and use it as a deterrence in case anyone tried to get on Eros while the Nauvoo was working its way there. He's going to take one of the nukes from the ship, find the quote-unquote control nerve center of the proto-molecule, and detonate it along with himself to allow the nukes to hopefully hit Eros instead of having Eros dodge them like it did the Naboo. So there's the context. He has a realization that Eros is being controlled by Julie Mao, which, man, what a twist that was. I did not expect that in the slightest. And I was wondering, because as he's going through Eros Station and on the way to Eros from Tycho, he was listening to the live feed that Protogen had set up so that they could monitor. And he's listening to Eros start speaking again. And he's hearing all these voices and all these conversations that he thinks are coming from the protomolecule, learning from the systems that have a lot of recorded audio in it. And one of the things he's hearing as he's going through the station is it's something along the lines of you can't take the razor back, you can't take the razor back. And it's being shown as two different words. You can't take the razor back. And I'm sitting there thinking, as I'm reading that, I was like, wasn't Julie Mao's her racing ship called the Razorback? I couldn't quite remember because it had been like 500 pages at this point. But I was like, isn't that Julie Mao's her racing ship thing? Wasn't it called the Razorback? I wonder if that's supposed to be something about Julie Mao. And lo and behold, Miller makes the connection by realizing it's you can't take the Razorback, it's you can't take the Razorback. And he gets this realization it's Julie Mao, and he contacts Holden, and he's like, I gotta find her, I can talk to her, and I can get this to stop, and we won't have to worry about the nukes. And that kind of sets up this final confrontation between Holden and the United Nations Navy. But before going too much into that, I want to stick with Miller and Julie Mao. What a great finale for Miller. Searching for Julie Mao, finding her, and his first real conversation with her. His first and probably last. Well, maybe not last, since they were together for the week or so that it would have taken for Eros to make it to Venus. But it's the only conversation we ever get with Miller and Julie. And it's short, it's sweet, and it's very casual, all things considered. But it felt like such a great final note for Miller. It felt like his entire story was just, it came around full circle. He finally accomplished his mission, kind of. He never brought her back to her family, obviously, but he found her. He found Julie Mao, and he kept her safe in the end. And it's great. It's such a beautiful ending for Miller.
I think Julie Mao, speaking of, her reappearance in the story, she really took her transformation surprisingly well. She did not freak out nearly as much as I would have expected, because when he does find her, she is she's compared to like a mermaid of sorts, so like her torso is still there. I guess that we can probably presume her face is still probably, if not the same, pretty similar to the way it had been left. Or so she didn't have any eyes at that point. Oh no, they actually pointed out that she'd grown new eyes. Whereas before, when we saw her when we saw her as the corpse, she did not have eyes. They had been replaced because tentacles or something had grown out of them. But they did point out that she did have eyes. So I guess all things considered, she really took the transformation. She wasn't very freaked out by anything. She took things very calmly, and I think that's either a very strange choice on the part of the authors, or a very indicative that she's maybe the most resilient person ever to live. Because I don't know, to wake up and realize that you've become some sort of eldritch abomination that exists at this nerve center that is controlling a space station. That would be. I feel like there should have been maybe more existential distress that would arise from that kind of situation. But regardless, I thought that you as you rightly point out there, it is a very nice moment. Miller gets to find her, and they get to have a moment where they are not. It's not necessarily super romantic, but I think he gets to feel some sort of closure vis-a-vis his own growing romantic feelings for Julie Mao.
Yeah, and I love how they end the chapter, his final chapter, with him with her, and we haven't gotten an absolute that his plan worked, but it's just him trying to comfort her and get her to do the right thing, and we don't see the result of that until the final chapter of the book, the last Holden chapter, the immediate following chapter. And man, I don't know, the imagery that was used to describe what happened to Eros was just, I don't know, it was as they say in the book, it was beautiful. You have it careening past the Earth, heading on a course towards Venus, which is very funny because when the last time Holden and Miller talked, and Miller's like, well, where should I tell her to send Arrow Station? And Holden is just like, I don't know, Venus. Just kind of as a, I don't know, man, figure it out kind of thing to say, just throwing something out there. And then when they learn that it's on a course, it's changed course to Venus, Holden's like, that was a joke. And Naomi's like, a good one, apparently. But having it make it to Venus, and then it just separates in like clumps of a dozen until it becomes these tiny particles that just go into Venus. And the last thing we see is the lightning storms over Venus as Miller, Julie, and Eros have vanished into the planet. And man, I really hope the TV show nails that scene, because man, the sight of it in my mind was just something to behold.
Yeah, I wonder how they handled that. Also, it must be difficult. It probably would be difficult to, have the budget to make that scene really come off,
Especially since at that point in time it was being made by Sci-Fi.
Oh.
I think it had like 2 or 3, maybe 4 seasons on Sci-Fi, then it was canceled and then picked up by, I want to say, Amazon.
That's not a slam on Sci-Fi, by the way. That is just like that. That they don't have the budget of like of what an Amazon show would, like they would later.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a fact of the matter is that you're not going to get Game of Thrones quality, or even just modern network quality, something like Lost or Heroes, or I'm naming shows that are really old. I don't know modern TV shows on those TV stations. You're not going to get something that you would find on like ABC or NBC or Fox, even on Sci-Fi, because it's a fringe science fiction channel. And that doesn't necessarily affect the quality of the show itself. It can still be a great show. It's just you're not going to get that quote-unquote high-quality CG or set design or production design or whatever that you would get from a standard network. But I still hope that the show did all of this really well. I've heard the show's amazing from start to finish, so I'm going to assume that it did it well, or at least well enough. So, I don't know. I'll see when I watch it. But
one other thing that I would point out is when we get the epilogue with Fred, they mention. Did you see the latest feed from Venus? 2-kilometer high crystal towers. Yeah. So after Julie Mao and the protomolecule and all of that that collides with Venus, it's pretty, it's still doing something. So I don't know. There's something that's kind of cool about that too. And I bet that would be a really cool and striking scene as well.
Mm-hmm. I love that Fred asks Holden, you sure it wouldn't have been better to tell Miller to send it to the sun? And Holden's response is, well, I feel like a crystal tower coming out of the sun would be a lot creepier.
Which is probably true.
Yeah.
But I wonder if it would have survived a collision with the sun. It shouldn't have survived the collision with Venus, so who knows?
Well, it didn't really collide with Venus. It stopped. It dead stopped in the atmosphere and then came apart.
Well, yeah, it broke up in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
But I guess they did. So there was not. It wasn't like a like two billiard balls the way they hit each other. But it's just like, it broke up in the atmosphere of Venus and kind of dispersed.
Yeah. So that's more or less how Miller's story ends, and I thought it was great. I'm sad to see him go. He was my favorite character, and I loved his journey
He was great.
from this book.
A very, very well written character. I think that was probably I don't know. I think he was definitely the highlight of the book for me. Just seeing his internal workings, and like we've mentioned before, and I think he was a great character.
Yeah, for it's more so a difference in tone in terms of the perspective characters, but having the difference between Holden and Miller was really well done, because Holden is, as they say, super righteous, probably the most good man in the entire solar system, and to a fault.
I would dispute that. I don't necessarily agree, but he believes he is righteous, or he wants to be righteous.
Yeah, and I do feel like from a moral standpoint, he probably has a lot more of an objectively good stance compared to anybody that really truly matters, because even someone like Fred has a lot of, not necessarily gray, but a lot of, well, I've murdered people and in cold blood, and that's just kind of the way things had to be, and I don't love that I did it, but I did it, so whatever. Whereas Holden is like, if I have the choice, no.
I think the thing about Fred, though, is that's why he's joined the OPA. I think it's his way of trying to atone for what he's done, but also by the very virtue of the position that he occupies within the OPA, he has to make calls that will lead people to dying. One of the prime example of that being when they're doing this situation where they're trying to chase after Arrow Station, they're in the Rocinante, and they're following after them, but they're required to do so at G-force levels that are not sustainable. That would until they figured out a workaround to use transponders left behind by OPA craft who were that rigged it up to be ready for the Nauvoo, the original Nauvoo collision plan. Until they figured that out, he was essentially asking them to sacrifice themselves, to be able to maintain targeting on it, because as the ship, or as Arrow Station, when it went to start heading back towards Earth, it dropped off of the radar scopes somehow, so they had to have the Rocinante following behind it to make sure it's still able to target. So I don't but I think that he is also that kind of character where he is another character like Miller, and like Holden too, that is kind of seeking their redemption,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's certainly true. I think the difference between someone like Fred and someone like Holden, at least from a morally righteous standpoint, is Holden is very much, he has to deal with very similar decision making and situations, but on a much more micro level, because he's only having to determine the fate of him and 3 other people, whereas Fred has always been in a much more grand stage of power comparatively to where he had to not only deal with the lives of his direct men, but the entire force, A, that he had control over, and B, that he was attacking, that he was fighting in the first place. So there definitely is a lot more blood on Fred's hands than Holden's, just through the sheer fact of their positions. Though we do know that Holden did have a past in the Navy, and he's probably killed plenty of men in the Navy as well. But that's a little different because it seemed like it was just him looking at a screen and pressing a button. So I don't know. I don't really think I have a point here other than I guess they both have their own form of what they find to be morally right, and they both try to follow it. But Holden has his a little more idealistic.
I think, and I think you hit on something important there. He is more idealistic, but I think it is partially by virtue of the fact that his area of what he is responsible for, what he has power over, is a lot smaller. So I think that's one thing that's, as one would continue in this series, I would wonder also how you how that would impact Holden, because I imagine he is going to be around as a point of view character, if not for the rest of the series, at least another book or two. I would be interesting to see how these experiences change him, because towards the end he also I don't want to say he adopts Miller's extreme moral relativism, or I guess more dogmatic moral relativism. But he does have this conversation with Naomi where she's like, essentially Miller was right about, killing Dresden. And
Yeah.
he does push back against it initially, but as the conversation goes on, he at least, if he doesn't necessarily agree, he's in the he is in the place where he understands now. Whereas before, he totally just, maybe because of his own, it's a projection of his own compunctions that he has, or he's had over his life about the people he has killed, and the ambiguity he feels about that, and maybe he just projects that onto Miller, so that he's like, wow, because he can't imagine a situation where he would want to kill again. And he kind of puts that on Miller. He's like, I can't believe you just did that. Whereas after his conversation with Naomi, he's like, okay, well, I do kind of now understand that there is a certain valence in what Miller did, because he specifically, and I'm not sure how he didn't notice this at the time, but there is a lot of but Dresden was a very powerful and very wealthy and well-connected person. So he didn't seem to kind of realize that how Miller factored that into his calculation when he killed him in the last section that we read. But I think that was an interesting conversation as well, to kind of see how that might impact how Miller, or how Holden will see the world moving forward.
Yeah, he seemed to keep fixating on the point that he was defenseless and not innocent, but he wasn't a threat at that time. And Naomi makes it a point to say he was, but just not in the more physically present sense that you're thinking. Yeah, he didn't have a gun. Yeah, he wasn't trying to attack anyone or anything like that. But what he did have was influence and power. And she even says, how long would it have taken for him to charm or bribe a guard that was holding him to let him go, and then he'd be free to go do whatever he wanted? And it's not about looking at it as, this man has no weapon, he's defenseless, he's our prisoner, he should not be shot and killed. And you have to look at it more so as, the influence and power that this man has is more powerful than any weapon in existence. And that is shown perfectly in the start of the chapter, the Miller chapter, where he kills him. You read it last week, where when he looks at Miller holding up the gun, he doesn't even register it as Miller holding a gun. He just sees it's like he sees it as him just holding something that he's pointing toward him. And the line's like, even a dog would be afraid, but he wasn't. And that's the point, is this man doesn't need that. He doesn't need these trivialities of such uncivilized humans to get his way, to exude his force. So that's why Miller shot him. That's why Miller found justification in shooting him, and that's why Naomi is like, look, I was hard on him because you were pissed, but he was right, and you need to understand this. So I do think that was an important conversation for Naomi to have with Holden, because he needed to have a little bit of a wake-up call from his remarkably naive, almost black and white view of morality and what is right and what is wrong. I don't know if that's going to stick. It seems like it might, if we're going off of the epilogue when he's talking to Fred and they're talking about Miller, and we learn Miller's full name. I don't remember how to pronounce his middle name. I was looking at it and I was like, Aloysius?
Isn't it Aloysius?
Yeah. I'm going off memory. I was thinking maybe Aloysius. So we learned his full name. Was it Josephus Aloysius Miller?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's talking to Fred, saying that Miller doesn't need to be an icon. He shouldn't be used as a tool. He should be shown as who he was, as a belter who chose to essentially kill himself to save the Earth. And Fred has the whole thing about how I'm going to use him as a tool, as an icon, because if we do anything otherwise, then it's going to not really serve the purpose that it needs to serve. So it's better that people see him for how I present him as opposed to how he really is, which there is an argument to be made about that for sure. But to my point, Holden is talking to Fred, and in reference to Miller, he says he was a good man, and Fred responds saying, no, he wasn't. And it's like, I don't think either are right. I don't think Miller was strictly a good man or not a good man. He was a complex man who had a lot of issues, but still had some good in him. It's, once again, you can't look at everything so black and white, because Holden was so quick to say that Miller was a bad man after killing Dresden, and how he couldn't trust him, and how he was even afraid that Fred was going to have Miller shoot him when they were talking about the plan for Holden keeping the safe with the protomolecule in it and the lab report files. And Naomi's like, Miller's on our side, he wouldn't do that. But Holden still had that view of he's now a bad guy, and even by the epilogue, he's changed his mind because of the sacrifice and is saying now he's a good guy. And Fred's like, well, no, he's not. So, I don't know, maybe this will stick with Holden in the future, or maybe he'll just default back to his naive black and white view of the world. But it's nice to see that he at least understood Miller enough to a point to not necessarily forgive him, but make peace with him by the end.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
But to move on from Miller, I don't really think I have much else to say other than just more praise on the writing of his character, because it was such a great character from start to finish, so much fun to read, so much fun to delve into. Unless you have something else to add for Miller, I would like to move on to the Holden half of this finale.
No, other than rest in peace, close quarter killer Miller.
Indeed. Shoot him in the thigh or the neck, Miller. So, to do a brief synopsis of the Holden storyline for this final bit. So, Holden and the crew are supposed to go out and intercept the scientific vessel and its escort on its way to Aero Station that is sent by the United Nations, and hold them up long enough for Miller and the ground crew of the OPA to come in, set the ships up on the docks with their bombs as a deterrence, their nukes, and get everything in place for the Nauvoo to come and ram it. So that goes successfully, more or less. Holden gets in contact with the ship. What was it called? The Racy? The Ravi? Is it Ravi?
Yes.
It's there. I kept looking at it, and I sometimes have to double take because they say the Ravi and the Rosi in like the same sentence, and I'm like, I'm glad I'm not dyslexic, otherwise that could have caused problems. So he gets into contact with them finally, and it's this brash, hothead kid, and he can't really get through to just have some sort of, hey, stand down don't come because we're gonna mess with you anyways. And they're like, oh, we're gonna blow you up. And so Holden just kind of puffs up his chest and says, hey, we're faster than you. We're better gunned than you. If you're gonna keep going at this, I'm just gonna bypass you and I'm gonna blow up your vessel that you're escorting, and that's gonna throw a wrench in your plans, isn't it? So that stops them. That's enough to stop them for the time being. And then eventually, once Arrow starts moving, it now goes from being this essentially this standoff to, plans have changed, because now he has to hail the Ravi and say, hey, Arrow's disappeared off your radar, right? And now he's talking to the Captain McBride, instead of the hothead kid. And she's like, yeah, it disappeared. And he's like, okay, well, I guess maybe we should start working together and work on getting this thing tracked down, because otherwise this is gonna destroy the Earth. So now they're working together, and together they come up with they eventually talk to and formulate the plan after they both have to give up on chasing Eros for the safety of the crew. They come up with the plan. Holden and Naomi do, with the Ravi turning on their transponder. He realizes, wait, we could just turn on the transponder to the 5 ships that the OPA docked with the nukes, and we can use that to triangulate Eros. If Eros is going to stay hidden, we'll have these 5 blips saying, hey, here it is. And so that's when they essentially have a joint operation to shoot all the nukes at Eros. And then, when Miller's like, hey, I need time because I'm going to find Julie and I'm going to get this to stop my way, we won't need to use the nukes. He talks to Fred and convinces Fred, by buying him off with the safe, with the protomolecule in it, to have the OPA redirect the nukes that are heading towards those, to the OPA ships on Arrow Station, so that they can buy Miller as much time as possible, but only divert and not divert, only delay, not divert. So they will eventually allow the missiles to come back around and hit Arrow Station as a last resort, but they're now buying him more time to work out his plan to see if he can do it, which he does. And once he does, they completely divert it and make an absolute mockery out of the Earth Navy, which is very funny.
Also pretty crazy to think about that they just launched all of their entire nuclear arsenal and are now basically entirely disarmed, or at least from a nuclear missile perspective.
Yeah. It is kind of funny to see the Earth essentially be detoothed like that, or defanged rather. So the last bit we really kind of get with Holden and the crew in relativity to the UNN is, because of the diversion, the Ravi decides that they're going to either destroy or board them. They say, hey, let us board you or we're going to fire. Holden basically not really calls their bluff, but shows them that either you're going to have to try and kill us and we're going to defend ourselves and maybe kill you instead, or you're going to not do this and we're not going to fight because this is pointless. And it ends up kind of working. They don't end up fighting, but it only ends up working because Miller succeeds.
Yeah, that's about at the time when the ship, or that Arrow starts breaking towards Venus.
Yeah, so we have a nice little, not quite Deus Ex Machina, but it's definitely a perfectly timed Miller to save the day kind of moment.
Miller Ex Machina.
Yeah, which really it's only for the Ravi as opposed to the Rossi, because let's be real here, there might have been some damage to the Rossi in the fight, but there's no way that the Ravi was going to take them down.
Didn't they have like an initial, not fight per se, but they basically outmaneuvered them so that they were behind them. So if they had wanted to, they could have taken out the Earth vessel.
Exactly. So really, Miller saved them and not Holden and the crew. So that kind of ends that conflict, and then the last thing we get in the chapter was them watching the feed of what happens to Arrow Station on Venus, and then we get the epilogue with Fred getting ready to talk to this joint, what's the word I'm looking for here?
Are you talking about the meeting Fred has with all of the dignitaries from Earth and Mars? I guess it's we could call it like a summit, a conference. A summit's a good word for that.
Yeah, Fred has this summit with Earth and Mars, and he's acting as essentially the prime minister of the OPA. And this is such a beautiful bit of not irony, but it's a little poetic that this summit is being hosted on Sarah Station, which is essentially not where all of this started, but it's where it's where Miller, his story started and where he's from. But for another, it's because of the Canterbury, which was on route to Sarah Station. So Saris was the first victim on a grand scale of this war. So I find it's very poetic that this is where it is.
It's like poetry. It rhymes.
Exactly. We've once again come full circle. And Holden has his final meeting with Fred where they talk about Miller, as we mentioned earlier, and he's just like, hey, give me some amnesty. I'm not giving the Mars ship back. The Rossi's mine. Do the salvage laws. Make sure that they're not coming after us. And, just don't get me imprisoned. And that's their final conversation. Fred's basically just like, I'll do what I can because that's all I can really say. And that's how the book ends, is he goes out to go have his speech to the masses. Fred does. And that's more or less the plot at this point. That's the end of the book. We did it. Woo!
Yeah, I hope it goes well. I like Fred. I really liked the epilogue chapter, by the way. I really enjoyed his perspective. It reminded me a little bit of what's his name? The first Mass Effect book that Drew Karpyshyn wrote.
I didn't read it.
I don't know. He kind of reminded me of Anderson in the Mass Effect series, both in the first Mass Effect novel, which actually came out before the game came out, and also in the games. He reminded me a little bit of that sort of like old Navy guy, but but it's that combination of like the discipline and the hardening that kind of life gives you, but also a certain sort of wry sensibility and a warm humanism that in both the characters of Anderson and also Fred. Who it's very funny that the book is very adamantly, it calls Miller and Holden most of the time, but it always just calls him Fred. Or maybe not always, but oftentimes just refers to him as just Fred, even though he's, like you said, essentially the de facto prime minister of the OPA.
Yeah, he's the most informally described character in the book in terms of naming structure. He only has his full name stated when it's somebody referencing who exactly he is. It's always, all the characters call him Fred, which I think he asks them to anyway, so that's just, that. But, yeah, everyone else, it's always, even the crew calls Holden, and obviously Miller's always going by Miller. He never states himself as otherwise. But we have Alex, Amos, and Naomi, who are all using their first names too, but Holden is always Holden. And we have this big, probably in terms of major characters, the most important character in the solar system. And his name's Fred.
He's just chilling. Fred's chilling.
Yeah. I'm really glad, like I said earlier, I'm glad I was wrong with my theory of Fred turning heel, because I didn't want it to happen. I just knew that there were pieces there that could make it hypothetically happen. And I was like, it could. I would like it to not, but it could. So I'm glad that wasn't the case.
In the hands of a less subtle or talented writer or writers, that would have happened. Fred would have become. It would have become this very. I don't want to say juvenile, but there is a certain juvenility to it. It's this like, you can't trust anybody. You can only trust yourself. Everyone is bad. That kind of thing. That a lot of sci-fi in this era anyway, that was kind of a little bit of a trope.
Yeah, and maybe it's just me being victim to enough of that tropey writing for me to just immediately expect, oh, well, where's the twist gonna come where Fred is suddenly the last villain of the book? And It didn't happen because this book is well written. So, which isn't necessarily to say that anytime that happens, it's bad writing. But it
No,
definitely feels tired.
yeah, and it requires a certain touch to do it, and otherwise it just comes off as like aughts cringe. But
A gimmick?
like I said, they're I think they could have. They're talented enough that I think they could have carried it off with it only being a moderately like. Well, I wouldn't have done that, but they're talented enough, I think, to see that it kind of became a thing, kind of a little bit tired, a little bit long in the tooth at that point, and kind of zagged there. So
Yeah.
credit to them.
Yeah. But how do you feel about the crew of the Rocinante at this point? So we have the Holden and Naomi relationship finally blooming into something.
Well, as far as how I feel about them, I think Holden is kind of growing as a character a little bit. If he were to continue the path that he's on, I'm sure I would grow to like him more. But as I definitely liked him more by the end of the book than I guess the nadir for me was somewhere around the second act, where I was like, okay, I really just do not like this guy. I don't care anything about him. I don't care whether he lives or dies. But by the end, I was like, okay, he grew on me a little bit, and I think he grew as a person, which was also very what made some very welcome had some welcome growth. So I don't know. I'm generally pro Holden at this moment. Like I said, I like Naomi. I think she's a very smart, very canny person. She's a lot more, I guess, emotionally intelligent or perceptive in that way. And that's kind of always been the way she's presented in the book, and that's it's a lot. It's nice to read. Sometimes that could be, in the hands of a less talented pair of writers, they could have just used her as like an exposition. Just like she comes in and says things that clear things up for readers that maybe miss something, or to make Holden. Although she does kind of serve that function for Holden, like she kind of is able to really from the moment that they meet up, she's she kind of clocks Miller as a friend, or at least friendly to their general cause from the very beginning, and she's taking him aside like, hey, go easy on this guy. He clearly knew Julie, because they didn't know the nature of his relationship, such as it was with Julie, but she could tell that he was affected in that moment. She's also very helpful as in terms of like analyzing the Holden character. She can kind of provide certain color about his past actions and the way he interacts with other people. So I don't know. I really like Naomi as a character. Amos, he's okay. He's just like, he's one of those guys that's just like dumb muscle. If this took place in like the 1930s instead of the future, he'd be like, "You got it, boss." He's that guy. But for Holden, Alex, for the most part, he has like nice moments where he'll do something and you're like, "Oh yeah, that was pretty smart. Good job, Alex." But mostly he seems there as like almost a joke character. He's like, hey, here's this guy. He's kind of fat and he has a Texas accent and he flies the plane.
Yeah, it's like
flies
I said,
the spaceship.
Yeah, it's like I said in a previous episode. It seems like Alex is important to the characters, but he's not important to the plot.
And it's kind of a shame, because I thought he'd be more important than he ended up being.
Yeah, I definitely hope that there's room for him to become a more important character in the later novels, because I do feel like, obviously, Holden is the main character. He's going to get the biggest pull out of the entire group. And, of course, Naomi is as well because she's the second in command. She's the love interest, and she's a great character, straight up. But other than that, you'd expect Amos and Alex to at least have a similar amount of pull in the writing based on their importance in terms of being a part of the crew. But all we really get from that is Amos. And I think he's very fun. He's a very well established and very well written character to fit the role that they wanted him to play, and his color commentary is sometimes a nice little comedic break in the action. So I definitely appreciate Amos, and I do think that he got the right amount of development and focus in the story. And then Alex is just he exists, and it's fine. I don't feel like the book is worse because Alex didn't get that amount of focus as even Amos got. But it is something that I do wish will be rectified in later on as the series progresses, that we get a more fleshed out Rocinante crew that's a lot more rounded in terms of its characterization and focus, as opposed to it clearly being Holden and Naomi with some nice look at with Amos, and then you just have Alex. So that's something I would like in the future, but like I said, it is by no means a detriment to Leviathan Wakes.
Yeah, the only and I understand that this you have to make some decisions when it comes to storytelling, and that this book is by no means a short book. It's around 560 pages, and even then you still have to be smart about what you have in there versus what you cut. But I do think that Alex could have provided a good how Holden has like a more Earth perspective. Miller had a more Belter perspective. Not that he had to become like a, what is it? Is it a tritagonist? Not protagonist, deuterotagonist, and then there's, is it a tritagonist?
I'll take
either way, he didn't have to become the third protagonist. It just would have been nice to have a more Mars perspective, and he kind of does that a little bit when they're on the Donager, the Mars craft. That he was kind of useful from that perspective, but I would have liked that more throughout the book.
Yeah, from there on, after the Donager, it just kind of becomes a character trait that they just kind of mention when it's necessary to. They're like, oh yeah, Alex is from Mars, and it's not really used other than just to say, if I was talking about you, I'd be like, oh, Daniel is from Texas, and that would be that. It would be like your use of knowledge that would come from exclusively being a Texan, which I don't really think that is any form of expertise, but just for sake of this argument, is never used in anything. It's just when I need to say something about you, it's you're from Texas, and that's that.
Right.
So it's definitely, if I'm going to have this concession, it's definitely a weakness of the book that Alex is used how he is. But he's not a major character. He's only supposed to be seen as any form of major because he is part of the Rocinante crew. So I think it's so much so it's me trying to prop him up as something more than he is, and having that, even if it's very, very minor, that minor disappointment that he's not. So that might be a me thing.
Yeah, I mean, and I wouldn't even necessarily regard it as a disappointment per se. It's just one of those things that I think could have been used more effectively, is all.
Yeah. So I think we've hit that point. Final thoughts about Leviathan Wakes, Daniel?
Leviathan Wakes was a very well written book. I think it really excels in terms of plot. Two different junctures, particularly the Aero Station moment, and both Aero Station moments really. When Miller and Holden were on Aero Station, and there was like the whole the initial infection outbreak, that was a very that was a real page turner. In that moment, I stayed up like after my bedtime for the first time, reading for the first time in like I don't even know how long, maybe maybe 15 years, 20 years, who knows. So and then again, that same thing happened when we got to the point where they were, when they were tracking Aerostation. After Julie Mao and her and the protomolecule had taken it over. That was it was another moment where I was literally staying up past my bedtime for an hour and change to get just because I was so engrossed in finding out what happened next. So that I have very, very high praise for that. I think the world that they built is very interesting, and for the most part, a pretty good representation of how society would conceivably stratify as it kind of goes out to the different sections, to the belt, to Mars versus the people that are still from Earth. I think that was very well done, and I think it was all pretty interesting. I think the characters, even though I've been mentioning that I've been kind of lukewarm on them to a certain extent, that does not necessarily mean they were poorly written. They were actually quite well written, particularly Miller, who, as I said before, is he's a very rich and layered character, the way that you don't always see in genre fiction like this. So he's I have a lot of praise for their writing just in general. I think it's a very good book. I think that I think there are things about it that maybe some people may or may not like. I think it deals with mature themes in terms of like suicide and violence and interpersonal violence, sexual assault. There is a lot there that if you have not read this book, that would be if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, you might have some problems with this book. But I think largely if you're into sci-fi, I definitely would recommend checking it out. Give it a shot. I think most people would come away with this pretty positive.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. It's no secret that I absolutely adored this book. This has been such a treat for me. I feel like I haven't read a book this captivating and just this engrossing in a very long time, for me at least. And I don't know. I feel like there's so many things I could say about it that I loved. It was, I think the thing that really did it for me is I'm such a sucker for character writing. Like, my favorite TV shows are character-based TV shows, not plot-based. So if you give me good, well-written, well-fleshed-out, well-motivated characters, I'm gonna have a much easier time falling in love with the book than if it was just purely a very good plot. So the characterization in this novel was just fantastic. I loved it from start to finish. I loved how all the major characters were handled, how they were written. Everything felt believable to me in terms of their motivations, their personalities, their convictions, and it flowed really well. The pacing of this novel was fantastic. I never felt like anything was dragging or moving too quickly. I think everything happened when it needed to, and I don't know, it felt great to read. I don't really know a better way to put it other than it just felt great to read. It was such a fun book, and I loved it. It was great. I don't know what else to say other than being outside of repeating myself. This book was a 10 out of 10 for me.
That's a good point that I didn't mention. That this is a very well-paced book. If you're reading it, if you've never read it before and are curious about it, there's never really a moment, a chapter, even a page where you're like, okay, this is just kind of filler. Everything feels very necessary, and it feels like it's building towards something.
Yeah. And I will say, once again, Daniel, you have chosen the perfect stopping point for this episode.
Well, I mean, it's hard to get any better than the last page.
Yeah. Any book knower supremacy you want to brag about for this section?
I just want to just pat myself on the back one last time for getting the extraterrestrial alien thing going, for clocking that from the beginning. I just it was, I feel like that they worked a lot. They worked pretty hard to kind of hide that aspect of it. But I think one thing that they did that was kind of clever was that it was an extraterrestrial threat, but they kind of wrapped it back around into a very familiar threat and one that is relevant, even now, is this idea of wanton corporate greed and sociopathy. And so I thought that was a very clever, I guess this is me patting them on the back too. I thought that was very well done as well.
Yeah, maybe this was my lack of attention on any possible clues that would have been used, but I definitely personally would not have had the thought of extraterrestrial interference in my head without you having brought it up in, what was it, the second episode or the first? I think it was the second.
It probably was the second.
Yeah, because I think it was when we were talking about the Donager, the attack on the Donager. So it definitely was not something that I would have been thinking about without you having essentially planted the thought in my head back then. So when it did come around and it was revealed that the protomolecule was extraterrestrial in origin, I just immediately thought back to that. I'm like, oh man, Daniel was right. Nice.
I don't know. I think that's very interesting, and that's a thread that I would like to see where that goes. Later novels. I feel like that's not quite done yet. Where I think this sort of I'm just going to call them the progenitors. It's probably not that's probably not like the most clever thing there, but this race that existed billions of years before the development of human life, that sent the protomolecule to do some form of terraforming or some sort of transformation of all organic matter on Earth all those billions of years ago. I wonder if that's ever going to circle back around. I would probably bet that it does.
I do think that's a safe assumption. Otherwise, I guess the entire 9-book series would be focusing on the socio-political conflicts between Earth, Mars, and the Belt.
Yeah, and that would be hard to do after you already kind of open yourself up to a galactic level to kind of like crunch it back down.
Yeah, not impossible, but with 9 books, I feel like you would have to get some sort of external force to throw in a new conflict for everyone to deal with.
Well, that should wrap it up. I'd like to thank everybody for coming along this journey with us, for listening. I'm very excited about what we've got next. Do we want to tell them, or do we want to keep it a surprise?
No, let's definitely keep it a surprise.
Okay, fair enough. But yeah, I think you'll like it. This is a little bit of a change of pace, and it's quite a bit shorter, so it'll just be a little short diversion, and then we will be probably back covering our natural sci-fi beat.
Yeah, I'm not sure because we haven't gotten far enough to the book after next, so still some deliberations there, but yeah, I definitely feel like I could have talked about this book more and more. We did a very kind of bare bones summary, and I did want to focus more or so on the characters this time as opposed to the plot as a whole, because I felt like that was more important, especially in this section, despite it being the end of the novel. But yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I could talk about this book for hours. It was so good.
Well, thank you everybody for listening. This is Daniel.
And this is Dusty.
And we'll see you next time.
Take care.